Well, I give up waiting for an appropriate place to begin in my thinking. I found a word in the OED, aporia. It was being used to mean a sort of moment of confusion, but its ancient meaning is very interesting. It's a complex subject that somebody understands, but they can't find a point of departure, a place to begin. The springboard into the topic needs to be established in a moment of insight into the complex critique that is constantly at work as things come to light and fall together. This is 2020. I'm pushing 60. Not the greatest time for people like me. Elderly, living in Section 8 housing alone with diabetes. Not complaining, just pointing out that the Donald Trump era and coming up against Joe Biden is a little bit of a future for people with a past like mine, even though it's taking place now, meaning we have experience. The elderly know things, have experienced things. I was raised by the World War II generation. I received a letter from Martha Gellhorn on one occasion, who lived with Eleanor Roosevelt in the White House for a time, before she became an overseas correspondent for Collier's magazine. She was a gifted, healthy moralist on the front lines of war for a long, long time. That generation was a remarkable generation. And Kennedy was part of that generation when he was wrongfully extinguished as our leader by a new generation who snatched the torch back from his leadership when he said that the older generation was paving the way for a more progressive vision. They disagreed, some of them. And we now live with the consequences of this disaster to our educational processes and continuity and intellectual heritage, which, with respect to the world, is primarily about the First Amendment, the freedom of the press. I saw some of this generation not only because my father was a naval lieutenant who became chair of philosophy of education at the University of Pittsburgh, but also because my grandfather was a copy editor for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. So when I had the misfortune at the age of 3 of losing my treasured leader, something my mother said made me never the same again. You know, you might say there's still a bit of a child in me about the whole thing. I didn't give up confidence or faith in our people because I was surrounded by mature gentlemen who seemed to represent the best in us as well. I've heard that challenged by researchers who don't particularly trust my family. I wouldn't know for sure. I was just a child. But I've followed things closely and researched things. I've researched television and film semiotics by the people who did it. Put out The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Lee Marvin and Ronald Reagan's The Killers, and even some older things in the racism of Hollywood, like The Birth of a Nation. And of course, there are people who blame American principles, that the American people are sometimes bad. I don't do that. I mean, I look at Frederick Douglass, who had been a slave and contradicted the premises of the 4th of July when slavery was still being tolerated. And that I understand. The practices are so gruesome at that era that they outweigh, contradict the principles. He wanted to see the principles asserted meaningfully. And that was his goal. And I believe the same thing. I think that American principles are fine. But they need to be asserted from people who seek to contradict them in gruesome ways. And one of the things that happened with Kennedy was that a new dialogue began to be voiced over in American politics, saying that these things had to happen, that they were the nature of reality, that these things should happen. I disapprove and disagree. But I have also been victimized by that way of thinking, so they have also given me something to think about in return for my disapproval and disagreement. I haven't been cowed entirely. I still continue to discuss things, but I'm not a particularly influential person. And people are mean about what I've concluded. You know, they say, you know, you don't understand the nature of reality. You're wrapped up in warped premises, and they refuse to look at the evidence, and which is, you know, rather telltale. But a number of people do continue to research these issues, mature researchers who subscribe to the principles of the American Library Association, as I do professionally. I was a clerk, meaning I can't answer research questions, but I work with librarians, and I understand the thrill of victory and agony of defeat that attend each and every library question. Librarians are very gifted and attentive to the questions that come to them. If you haven't had the pleasure of working with librarians, I suggest you take a really hard-nosed question that's been bothering you to one of them and ask them. You'll get a remarkable response across the board in public libraries, college libraries, community college libraries, university libraries, specialized libraries like law schools and medical schools. You'll get attention to detail and concern for a good answer from librarians. So I respect the Library Society and the principles of the American Library Association, not so much the entertainment. And the topic of my discussion today is Adrian Belew. And the question is he an imbecile or is he a traitor? Most of us have heard Ronald Reagan was just stupid, Donald Trump was just stupid. Well, being president of the United States is overachieving for a supposedly stupid person. But you have to leave some room for credence. Maybe somebody is stupid and they're just in over their head with something. I don't know. That's why I posed this question. I don't have a librarian who can answer it for me. I have a few questions that librarians have never really successfully answered, like, is there a very good piece of historical fiction about the Ottoman Empire? The best I found was a vampire story about called The Historian that sweeps through the Ottoman centuries. You know, from Transylvania to London, it takes an arc through the Ottoman centuries. But I haven't read it yet. But it's the most interesting. Brides of Suleiman doesn't appeal to me. But I've wondered, why didn't James Michener take it on? Suleiman was quite a character. You know, they were fairly liberal. And I think it's probably because of Christian society and the publishing priorities of Christian society that it never really got done. There's some fairly good historical books about the Ottoman Empire. The story isn't shrouded in darkness. It's not a Dark Ages issue, but the Dark Ages is, of course, an issue when it comes to Christian society. It was the Muslims who preserved the Greeks through the Dark Ages. The Enlightenment began with Erasmus when he wrote an introduction to the New Testament, answering the Greeks after the Muslims gave the Greeks back to medieval society. So, we're looking at issues that are in the dark, but we're not in a dark ages. And the reason I ask what might seem to be a peculiar question, because most of you are going to say, "Who is Adrian Belew?" Is because it's an important question. It's an important question not so much to me, but to the circumstances that I am in. And it represents an angling going on from the society that killed Kennedy to disrupt and destroy and dismantle our keystone intellectual heritage and replace it with an incredible two-headed transplant. And this, of course, can be done by stupidity, by people who are brainwashed, or it can be done in malice. And if you look at some of the macabre things that have happened to us, they depend very heavily on personality cults. I mean, Kennedy even had a personality cult. It led some people to feel that he wasn't as important as those of us who realize what he was doing say he is. Because people do rightly distrust personality cults. They've done a lot of harm. And so, to understand Adrian Belew and his power doesn't necessarily understand a great deal of intimacy with his career, so much as the personality cults that he is wrapped up in, which made his career. The biggest one is David Bowie. I was partial to King Crimson. He was a guitarist in King Crimson. I'm not anymore, of course, and this dispute is central to the situation that I'm concerned with. But I saw, the super inflated, hyper obscure, self-regarding brilliant of King Crimson flip, jump up on his tippy toes with self-adulation that he played with David Bowie. I could hardly understand why, since King Crimson was a far better musical experience overall than that glitzy weirdo who everybody was bowing down to. But Belew went back and forth between them. He also played with Eddie Jobson and Frank Zappa's band. I brushed elbows with him. I gave him a postcard that Flip had sent me or something. I don't remember all of the weird things. But he got, I think, taping going at Carnegie Mellon University about me. And as anybody who has seen the picture that recently showed up in the context of all of my complaining about being brutalized after reporting being kidnapped and tortured knows, the people denying it, like Belew and Carnegie Mellon, insulted every man, woman, and child on earth when the picture was posted, and they denied that it was clear-cut corroboration of what had been done to me. They've been refusing to admit evidence for a long time. It took years for me to get anybody to allow me to film the neurotrauma in my facial nerve. And there was some question at first whether King Crimson's art had been used to inflict the neurotrauma or whether they themselves paid proxies to do it for them, which is what I now realize and didn't before, which made me easy prey for people like Belew to pick on. And so there's some question, does he realize he's working with these people, or is he just a gyrationist who's wrapped up in them and doesn't know? Or is he playing both sides for advantage? Because obviously they're going to say our art was just used. That's obvious. And the burden of proof is on somebody, no matter how bitterly and badly they victimize that person, which is perfectly clear to everyone how vicious they were towards me. To say they knew all along, or are they just callous about somebody who's not in their, band or something. So I got hit in the head blindside with this stuff, I mean, I didn't have anything to do with it. It just befell me. And then got subsumed into their power structure for production purposes. They were overlapping their personality called politics with the actual situation, which is that I was a human guinea pig in the AIDS war game that showed that AIDS was a cold-blooded attack. And it's interesting. I would have thought nobody would stand for it, but here everybody's saying, well, it's just a medical issue, we'll get by it, as sad as it is. Everybody knows it was a weapons system, la, 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 la. And they're, doing like this to the Holocaust Jews who pulled the thinking processes behind it and playing games with the key players like Reagan and Trump saying, oh, they were framed, and so forth, which I'm not sure is even possible in light of the evidence and what it dates to and how it implicates them and how it is supposed to exonerate them. It's like that book, The Man Who Framed Himself. But why they targeted me was in the script. They said, oh, well, the goody-goodies are twice as bad. And here was this goody-goody with a good family and an intellectual heritage stemming from Kennedy, so they could attack, use, brutalize, humiliate me as a very little boy, and then bring in Warhol, a friend of Trump, and say, oh, that was just the provincial standard, the norm of Pittsburgh at the time. And they hotwired around, the horrible violence that was inflicted on a child, violence which is clearly the norm of someone like Bob Dylan, with, the idea that it was seeking status as a victim or something, and they had these predatory homosexual guild making movies saying we should burn them at the stake, and it's very fiendish. And I talked to Greta Thunberg's lobby about this. I tried to get through to her about it because at the time I was interested in the politics of climate change at the school. I mean, the school was saying, oh, poor little Jimmy, he's an Aquarian flower child, because I wanted them to build a greenhouse and teach ecology. And I got mixed up with some people who were in the architecture field associated with Buckminster Fuller, who turned out to have built the Salk Research Labs, locked me in a house from the inside with a man who had brutally attacked and gassed me as a child. And King Crimson were apologists for this band, this gang of ruffians who tortured me. And they were following me around with people who were packing cigarette packs to the standard rhythms that were associated with King Crimson on Three of a Perfect Pair. Three of a Perfect Pair has the symbol for inclusion and exclusion, which would be worthy of Goebbels. And they were mucking around with the Gurdjieff Society, who wired me into the AIDS experiment on Mount Desert Island. And they were like, are you sexually normal? Well, in Pittsburgh, even people who weren't being used by the Neva Corporation pornographers, it was normal to sleep with your girlfriend. I mean, if that's their business, I don't really know why. I mean, they were evidently filming the inside of a house in Montana when Martha Gellhorn wrote to me without the consent of either of the people who were in that listening post. And the VA monitors, of course, are saying, well, this person is now alone in the world and looks at porno, so he's giving a tacit endorsement of this stuff. Not true. I've talked to women who are in the pornography field and, in fact, lobbied them about donating part of their funding to the combat of human trafficking. What that industry needs is Upton Sinclair. But you have all of these, law firms who have over here a pornography queen, over here a attack prostitute, over here Black Lives Matter agent playing dumb, all innocent and a Christian attorney, and it's like a smorgasbord. They can pick and choose, and the only thing they want to do is win. And they'll play nice until they lose, and then boy, are they evil. So those are the sort of situations that emerge when you look at these questions concerning the almighty gods of rock and roll and the issue of why they so wish to be known as people who um, advocate for laws right and left while claiming the almighty truth. There's no way for me to pause my video machine, so I can't really take a break. I have to either end on that note or it has to lead to something else. This might be a good point for you to pause yourself to think about that, but it does lead me to something about the dogma about laws. Penis Gabriel puts on the album he drafted me to without explaining what he was doing while he was helping John Schulman, recently arrested for museum theft, not kidnapping of a goody-goody, but museum theft. About pictures of soul with no leak at the seam, and you have Yoko Ono yammering, didn't have to tell a white lie on one of her records, and you have this pit of yammering dude coming out of ISIS, yada yada yada, running a brainwave through the neurotrauma, and the Gurdjieff Society saying, what does it mean to not lie? And they're tuning into this idea that they tortured and raped somebody who is themselves compulsive about reading magazines too long at the newspaper rack. In other words, they overstay their welcome, so they're trying to shoo people like me off the earth. They get rid of our grannies for personality cult politics. They run us into the street to protest Biko after killing our grannies, and in our chivalry we abandon our ex-girlfriends. No, we're good, we're true, we praise the Lord, Donald Trump. And we're the good kind. We stick with one girl, and all of this stuff. And then to get even with the idea that maybe it's okay to, be a confused young person. They tune into the neuroplasm, send me the girl of my dreams, while preying on the idea that I loved and trusted them, which are supposed to, of course, and then they yank it off like a gyroscope to watch the neuroplasm explode, leaving me vomiting and screaming and crying, and they'll jump down, hold PPC, see, the liar. So I'm dealing with the criminally insane. But you have the obvious fact of what they did emblazoned in this picture that recently showed up on me, which is exactly what I've been saying. They wouldn't let me show the neuroplasm. And you have this half-wit Belew playing with all of them, and you wonder, is that what he is, a half-wit? And these people ordered the rape of the girl who taught me sign language, who has Down syndrome, and then they mock her. Wire Club shows these people they murdered Cersei Kennedy. I mean, you have these people mocking people who are damaged. Belew, if you're just damaged, talk to Albert Pujols. He has a foundation for people with Down syndrome. I mean, you can be helped, you can be respected, but if you're damaged in such a depraved way that you're helping Joseph Goebbels get revenge on the United States, there's a sign for brother in Japan. It's right here.